How's it going? Oh, awesome. All right, I'll start. Thanks for debating me, man. Okay, so first off, I think we can agree that some framework on this round is needed. So I'll go ahead and frame it for us. The resolution is that schools should conduct mandatory drug testing on their students, and I'm going to limit the scope of this resolution to junior high and high school because that's where the majority of the data kind of exists, and that's where I think pretty much we're going to argue the principles behind this policy. I think also I want to frame this to something else. My second point of framework is that we can agree on several things about the public education system. I think number one, we can agree that it exists for the betterment of its attendees' mental faculties. And then B, I think insofar as it can do that, it exists to kind of help and better the quality of living of its attendees through the betterment of their mental faculties. So this is a policy resolution. So I have my plan all laid out and I can read that to you if you request it. But we really, I think, want to kind of debate the underlying principles of this about the legality, about the reasoning, rather than, oh, it's going to be implemented like this way comprehensively and it's going to cost this much. If you want to, ask those questions, that's totally fine. All right, so I'm going to have 1 point of positive matter in my first speech, 1 point of positive matter in my second speech, and then I'm going to talk mainly about why drug testing in schools works and why the data supports that in my third speech. So first of all, my first point of positive matter is kind of a moral responsibility for schools to use this to better the lives of the children that are enrolled. We really can't afford to mess this issue of drugs up with kids, and why is that? I think my first subpoint really is that schools, while they're not parents, they operate in kind of a gray zone legally where they're responsible for many of the things parents are, but they sometimes are not held to the same standard. So in order to give us a good metric for what schools can and should do, I'm going to basically just kind of throw out Kant's moral categorical imperative. If you have the ability to help the individual, then you kind of have the responsibility to help that individual. And in schools, what that looks like is schools are placed in a unique situation where they have the ability to help, but they're also entrusted with the well-being of the individuals who are at their school. So they kind of have the responsibility to help in that area, especially when it comes to the betterment of individuals. My second subpoint under my first point of positive matter is that teenagers' brains are still growing. So they are disproportionately affected by drug usage as opposed to adults, right? It is in the better interest of the school to prevent drug usage because they're the ones who are supposed to help the kids, and kids are disproportionately affected. The National Center for Addictive Substances and Abuse put this as kind of their definition. They said school administrators are charged with ensuring safe, supportive, and healthy school environment where children can learn and reach their full potential. This includes taking measurements to prevent tobacco, alcohol, and drug abuse among students, and I would really agree with that. The point here, basically, for this point of positive matter, really isn't to like envision this totalitarian regime that is lining kids up and making them pee in a cup, right? It's to envision a school that has taken on in the modern world a lot of the responsibilities that the parent.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to debate you. It's been a while, but I'm glad to be back into this. I strongly disagree with the notion that we should enact mandatory drug testing in public schools. The enormous cost would not be worth any tiny potential benefit. My first contention is that drug use is actually on the decline among students. A survey published by the National Institute of Drug Abuse in 2016 found that illicit drug use by students has dropped in all age groups measured and is now half what it was in the late 90s. Across the board, every type of drug, every age group, the use is declining. My second contention is that drug testing in schools is ineffective. First, the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2015 advocated supporting effective abuse services in schools while opposing widespread implementation of drug testing as a means of achieving substance abuse intervention goals because of the lack of evidence for its effectiveness. Second, the U.S. Department of Education study in 2010 found that mandatory testing had no effect on any group of students' reported intentions to use substances in the future. Third, they can't test for all drugs, which would lead students to try riskier, undetectable drugs like spice. Fourth, these tests are also ineffective for alcohol and drugs that metabolize quickly. It would encourage binge drinking, which is much more dangerous than sporadic pot smoking. Fifth, false positives jeopardize innocent students. If the policy were implemented right now, the 50.7 million students in the U.S. public schools, even a 0.01% false positive rate would mean 456,000 students would be penalized even if they never did drugs. Sixth, it's security theater. This provides the illusion of safety and security, but does nothing to address the psychosocial factors behind drug abuse. Contention 3 is that such a policy would harm students in schools. First, it securitizes schools even further, turning them into prisons with students as offenders. Second, to support use of limited resources and time. The money could be. Third, it violates students' right to privacy. Fourth, It punishes students for conduct off school grounds. Fifth, it punishes and inconveniences the vast majority of students who do not use illicit drugs. Sixth, introducing students to disciplinary action earlier in life predisposes them to involvement in the criminal justice system later in life, ruining thousands of lives. Seventh, this encourages truancy and dropping out. Eight, the negative consequences would largely fall on minority students and those from lower socioeconomic strata, replicating the racism of the drug war. Nine, testing may even punish the best students. As Time reported in November 2011, studies have shown a correlation between higher IQs and more illicit drug use. Next contention is that mandatory testing would be unconstitutional, blocking any chance at actual implementation unless we throw out the Bill of Rights. The Supreme Court has held that students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate, and that the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures in school. If this was implemented, it would teach our students that our sacred constitutional rights mean nothing. There are better approaches. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends advocating for substance abuse prevention programs in schools and supporting schools in developing intervention programs. The group of students that have substance abuse problems right now is largely underserved. A study has shown that less than 10% of adolescents with substance abuse disorders get treatment right now. We should be providing these services rather than criminalizing people from a young age. And that's my side.
Awesome. A litany of points that my opponents brought up in that speech, and we're going to cover a few of them before moving on to my second point of positive matter. I want to highlight a few of them that he brought up. Obviously, I can't cover all of them. First of all, I'm just going to bring up the whole privacy point that he brought under contention too. There was no evidence to support that, and we can't really even see, like, Brown versus Acton, which was one of the reigning Supreme Court cases that was brought up, proved that randomized drug testing of extracurricular students was completely constitutional, was not a violation of their privacy rights. Second of all, he brought up that this increases truancy rates and will go ahead and increase individuals' exposures to the criminal justice system. I'd like to turn that with my second point of positive matter. My second point of positive matter is kind of another addition to the moral responsibility of the school. Why? For two reasons. There's an additional moral responsibility of the school to administer mandatory drug testing. Number one, the randomized drug testing is an abject failure. As my opponent pointed out, if you vote for op judges, you basically vote for current status quo. You vote for randomized drug testing. The NCBI in 2005 said this: random testing will not identify all those young people who may benefit from early identification and supportive intervention. I'll go ahead and post a link after the speech. It's very clear. And then second of all, my second point underneath this positive matter too is basically that addicted teens, listen to this, addicted or teens who are exposed to drugs are 2 to 3 times more likely than their peers to get convicted, to get pregnant, and to stay addicted. This was from C.L. Caspi. He works for the Rand Institute. He said early exposed adolescents were approximately 2 to 3 times more likely than non-early exposed adolescents to be substance dependent, to have herpes infection, to have an early pregnancy, and to have failed to obtain educational qualifications. Early exposed adolescents also had significantly more criminal convictions than non-early exposed adolescents. So basically what we're saying is, even if, which I'll address in my third point, it's not, but even if it's ineffective, even if drug testing is completely ineffective, the school has a moral responsibility to do it, because they're going to find some kids who are not as smart, who are not going to other drugs, who are using drugs, right? It's for the betterment of the individual, for the betterment of the child. His cost analysis was basically non-unique, because we're dealing with a quality issue here, not a quantity issue. The quality of the children's lives, the quality of the betterment of their education is almost of incalculable worth. What kind of, what cost dollar value would he put on a child's life or on a teen's education? I don't think there is one personally, and I would be willing to implement mandatory drug testing programs just for the fact that it would help some teens across the nation. And that's really essentially why I want, mandatory drug tests implemented, if not only for that reason. Last point of refutation, he basically said that drug usage is ineffective, drug tests are ineffective. I'm going to go ahead and refute that in my third point of positive matter. We'll talk about some of the studies that have been done, some of the studies that have been brought up. At the end of the day, judges, I would urge you to vote because the school has a moral responsibility to do so, and it betters the children's lives who are in school.
All right, thank you very much for some excellent points that you made there. First, I'm going to start by comparing my opponent's case with mine, just to kind of illustrate the differences between the two. Now, he's making a moral argument here that says that we need to take care of these individuals. We have an obligation based on Kant's categorical imperative to help individuals, but we also have to, at some point, evaluate the benefit for students as a whole, benefit for the schools. We're talking about the school system, the education of the youth of this country, and that's why I think it's very important to start talking about things quantitatively. He claims that this is a qualitative matter. quantity of people that are currently using drugs is down. He completely ignores that point. He apparently thinks it's not relevant that the current rate of use amongst youths is half of what it was in the late 90s, in the early 2000s. He completely drops that fact. He also apparently doesn't think that it is relevant to discuss the fact that mandatory tests have no effects on students' intentions to use later in life. So all that terrible stuff he's talking about, the herpes, the pregnancy at a younger age, none of that is going to be helped by mandatory drug testing. It's actually going to be increased by that, which is the entire point about the fact that juveniles who get involved with the criminal justice system, who are penalized at an earlier age, are therefore predisposed to recidivism. There have been estimates that indicate that the recidivism rate is almost a quarter for people to get involved in the juvenile justice system to go into the later justice system. That means these people are going to be facing lifelong problems just because they got labeled for one drug test. Also, there's huge questions here about how many students we're going to test. Are we going to test all of them? If we don't test all of them, we don't test every day, then they'll learn that the drugs that are out of their system quicker are the ones that they need to be taking. He doesn't address this point at all. We're talking about the fact that if alcohol is out of your system in a short amount of time, then you can go binge drink on Friday, and who the hell cares if they're going to drug test you on Monday? This is a huge problem because maybe students won't smoke pot. They'll choose to do things that are out of your system quicker, like alcohol and cocaine and riskier drugs. He just completely leaves this out. Let's talk about the Brown versus Acton Supreme Court case that you discussed. Yes, that did affirm the right to test students in extracurricular activities, but only under the condition of the fact that those students already had a limited expectation of privacy because they were a football team and they undressed together in the locker room. I'm not kidding you. That is the actual justification for why their limited privacy was appropriate in that case. Also, in later cases, we've seen the Supreme Court, including Justice Ginsburg and Souter and two others, giving decisions or dissenting opinions saying that the Supreme Court affirms the fact that students have a right to privacy and that we should enshrine these constitutional rights in the school system. The random drug testing that you're talking about right now is very limited. The effectiveness of it is very limited. And yes, I'm defending the status quo. Keep it the way it is.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, so a little bit of refutation before I go into my last point. Matter. First of all, he said that drugs are on the decline, and the reason why I didn't respond to that was, one, because I didn't have time, but two, also that's completely non-unique. There's no impact to that. So what drugs are on the decline? High school students are still using them. We still should implement drug testing. Second of all, he said quantity is better over quality. He gave no analysis as to why this was true. He just said it was a fact. It's better. Third of all, he said none of this basically helps. He said that drug testing is going to help, where they're still going to get sent to prison. And the policy implementation of my plan is essentially the same mechanism that the status quo uses. They're going to randomize the testing. It's going to be comprehensive, as the resolution states. The students won't necessarily know when it's going to come. I'm essentially fiating these policy directives because I, as AF, have the ability to, right? Okay, so I see you agree. So let's go on to it's riskier. It's riskier, and essentially, like he said, they can use other drugs. That's completely true, but that's non-unique. That's unique. That's non-unique to the status quo. If you vote for neg, you're still going to get that same disadvantage. So it's not necessarily unique to the affirmative side. All right. Then last of all, he said basically the Supreme Court basically strikes down my plan and says it would be a violation of privacy. Guns are not allowed on school campuses. Drugs are not allowed on school campuses. As far as the Supreme Court is concerned, this is simply an extension of current legal practices on school grounds. School grounds are considered government property. So why isn't the rule of law enforced on the property? All right, let's go on to my third point of positive matter, which is basically that drug testing is effective. So there were two major studies that were done to prove that drug testing is effective. The first basically by one guy in 2009, Daniel T. Sheck from the Hong Kong Polytech University, and he did a comprehensive analysis of about 49 current pieces of literature that were out there on drug testing in secondary schools. It was currently the only one that covered all of the schools, basically, and he found that more than half of the studies that had been done were positive insofar as how the calculus worked. They decreased the amount of drugs that were used in the school, and they decreased the amount of students that used drugs. And he found that only 8% of students who used drugs were the ones who were expelled. Many times the school, if you're a first-time minor offender, lets you go. It doesn't just send you to juvie or expel you. They let you get out. They let you go to drug counseling, go to rehabilitation, et cetera, et cetera. That's how the status quo works. Second of all, the second study was done from the World Scientific Journal, and they basically did a multi-cohort, multi-year study on junior hires, and they found basically that junior hires benefited greatly from drug testing. And I can post the link in the comment section after this is over. This one basically found that almost by 50%, students who were using drugs stopped using drugs and benefited in the future because of it. So for these reasons, because drug testing works, and because it's not unique to the status quo, I would urge you not to vote for negative, because you don't follow your moral responsibility. And
all right, so he keeps saying that this is not unique to the status quo. We need to establish a difference between the system that we live in right now and the system that my opponent is advocating. Right now, under Brown versus Act and the Supreme Court decision that my opponent is talking about, the Supreme Court has said that in extracurricular activities, because of certain special conditions, schools can do randomized drug tests of people. That's the only population that they have done this in. There is no Supreme Court precedent for doing it on a wide scale, and we're talking on such a massive scale that this is basically drug testing for the entire population. A whole generation of people will be drug tested from this point on, and every successive generation after that will be drug tested, and we'll have their stuff on file. And the point that I made about the fact that people will use more risky drugs is very salient here. He tries to dismiss it by saying that, well, that's what happens in the current system. What do you think is going to be happening when all those students who aren't being drug tested right now all of a sudden have to worry about going into school and possibly getting drug tested for smoking pot on the weekend or experimenting with other drugs? Even if they are using drugs, that does not mean that they're abusing them. It also is activity that, once again, is taking place off school grounds. This is a huge violation of their right to privacy. Not to mention the fact that if they're getting drug tested, it's a violation of their right to medical privacy, because there's all sorts of drugs that have interactions with them. There's all sorts of drugs that show up as false positive, and then they have to disclose they have a medical condition, and that's why they're taking that drug. And so this is a big example of why violating their constitutional rights is super important as a consideration here. You don't get to fiat your way out of that, because this would be proposed through Congress. It would have to be passed as an act of Congress that's affecting the entirety of America's school system, or maybe through the executive branch. But either way, it would be reviewed by the judicial branch, which means that it's going to get struck down. The Fourth Amendment protections for students have been enshrined in several different Supreme Court decisions, and even though there are limited circumstances where people can be drug tested, it is not the same thing as mandatory drug testing for students in all schools for all of these. Next, we need to ignore these arguments for morality by the individual basis. That cuts out the fact that we're talking about 50,000 false positives. No test is 100% effective. A 0.01% false positive rate among a student population of 50.7 million means that 50,000 students are going to be under suspicion because of false positives. And then they're going to have to explain their way out of that, whether or not it goes in their permanent record, or they're suspended, or maybe there's some sort of judicial action that's involved. This is predicating them for failure. We're talking about something like the Pygmalion effect here, where you label students as criminals, you treat them as criminals, you make the schools into prisons, and then you have a self-fulfilling prophecy where people, all of a sudden, we have a huge pipeline into the prison system. How could you not see that?
All right, so I think essentially my opponent misunderstood my point when he said we have a pipeline to the prison. I'll start with his speech and kind of work my way back upwards with refutation. So he said we have a pipeline to the prison system. Schools are going to ruin and mar the education and the kind of the prestige that the kids could possibly have. And number one, I think there's two responses to this. Number one, only 8% of students who are found guilty of using drugs ever get expelled. They go to things like rehab. They go to things like drug testing. And number two, would you want a kid to live in a lie? He's addicted to drugs, but he maintains his kind of moral culpability. He maintains his kind of prestige that he has. Like that, I wouldn't want that kind of life for anyone. I think we want to address this issue with kids as soon as possible, get them out of the system, get them rehab. He goes on to talk about how this whole thing of false positives, and like school administrators are not dumb, right? They're not going to like go ahead and issue this with a black and white line. The reason why I have fiat over this issue is because we're not here to argue about whether or not the policy would pass, aka the judicial system. We're here to argue about the policy. What's good about the policy? Would it work? So fiat does cover me, because fiat is not to is make sure we don't argue about whether or not the policy would actually pass because there are too many Democrats in the House or because the judiciary would strike it down. We're here to actually debate the merits of the policy rather than if or not it would pass. So he goes, but on that note, in case you do buy it, judges, he basically says that there's no constitutionality under it. Number one, the school has constitutionality to take away your right to your Second Amendment rights while you're on campus, your right to have a knife, your right to personal self-defense. Like, why not drugs on a school campus? All right, so third of all, he goes, he basically says that the kids are going to go to riskier drugs essentially because they are going to learn how to game the system essentially. Now, I'm going to bite that at least half of it because I don't disagree. Kids are going to be able to game the system. That's just how life works. But I think there's two responses to this. Number one, that happens with randomized drug testing, which is why randomized drug testing is an abject failure. And then number two, the reason why this would work is because school administrators like know how to game the system too. Like they're going to institute a comprehensive like mandate for mandatory drug testing where kids don't know what day it is. Like school administrators are going to be able to implement this because they know their schools, they know their kids. They're going to be able to do this where it best benefits the students. So let's go on to some impact calculus essentially to kind of, transition into the late part of the round, the kind of end of the round. He basically brings up no response to my moral culpability. He just says moral culpability doesn't really have a place in today's round, and that's completely false. Moral culpability determines whether or not you should take an action. Categorical imperative tells us if you have the ability, then you have the responsibility. Schools have the ability and they have the ethical responsibility to safeguard the children's lives. What if we implement this policy and only one kid because he wasn't addicted to drugs, or only two kids, or only three kids? Would you still pass it? Like what kind of quantity is going to overcome that reasoning?
All right, thank you for that impact calculus that you gave there, because based on Kant's categorical imperative, we should treat every single proposal as if it were enacted as universal. So what you are advocating here is a universal mandated drug testing program for all students. And you also seem to think that randomized drug testing doesn't work. I'm not quite clear on that thing. But it seems like that categorical imperative means that you're advocating for a blanket implementation of this system. That's why we have to determine it quantitatively. Our moral calculus should be done on a quantitative level. What is the widespread impact of this? As of now, you have given zero numbers as to how many people we're going to catch based on this new mandated drug testing. And once again, you've left alone the fact that you're inconveniencing students that aren't doing drugs. You just make them all take drugs, even though less than 30% of students in some grades are taking drugs. They're just all going to have to take drug tests now. And you've left alone the fact that if they are drug testing all of the students, the ones that aren't going to show up on the drug test, i.e. the riskier drugs or the ones that are out of your system faster, are the ones that kids are going to switch to. That's not a problem right now because they're not enforcing mandatory drug testing in the schools. You can't dodge out of this one, man. Like, the fact is, we're not talking about the difference between right now where they're apparently drug testing everybody and in the future where they're doing the same thing. No, we're talking about orders of magnitude greater. I haven't even addressed the issue of the cost of this, like how much money it costs per drug test. It's $45 per. Let's leave that alone, but nonetheless, there are things that this money could be better spent on. This is a waste of people's time. You have absolutely no salient evidence to prove that there's any sort of quantitative benefit to this vast number of students. You have small studies that have been conducted on schools that test people in extracurricular activities. There's too many confounding variables there to apply that sort of thing to a large scale 50.7 million people drug test. The other thing that I want to bring up is that he's dropped the fact that Brown versus Acton is just about extracurricular stuff. So this would likely be a huge quandary in the Supreme Court. Now, he may fiat his way out of this and say the Supreme Court's cool with this, but if he does go with that, he's disregarding the fact that we should enshrine these values, these constitutional values from the Bill of Rights into our students. Just stripping them away from our kids in the school ground means that they're going to grow up to understand the fact that the Bill of Rights means nothing. They have no right to privacy. And yes, you're right, they can't carry weapons on school grounds, but that's a completely different set of legal precedent than the stuff that prohibits them from warrantless search and seizure upon students. At this point, you're infringing on their rights, and you're probably going to harm all of these students from false positives. I don't know what the numerical benefit.
All right. So first off, I just need to apologize that I just looked at my notes. The Supreme Court case is actually Brown versus Earl. So I completely mispronounced it and led you to do the same thing. So I apologize for that. Okay, so let's work again backwards from the refutation that he brought up. So first of all, he brought up that there's no salient evidence. And I think he misheard me when I said that Daniel T. Sheck from the Hong Kong Polytech Institute did a literature review of over it was like between 45 and 50 relevant studies. And it wasn't just national, it was international. These studies were done in China. These studies were done in South Africa. These studies were done in the US of multiple cohort, which is multiple different cohorts from different schools, and longitudinal. One of the studies that he did was over a course of 30 years. It started in 1970 and it went all the way through, 2009. So these studies are done not just on the US, but also on international soil to show that like drug testing does help kids. And he said over half of the studies, over 51% of the studies that he referenced showed that the kids from secondary education benefited from the implications of a drug test. And I'll post the link in chat. I'll post my notes in chat. You can see exactly his analysis that he brought through. All right, so let's go from the top. He talked about categorical imperative. He said, I am implementing universal. That's totally true. He says, I believe randomized doesn't work. That's exactly what I said. Randomized doesn't work. The reason why it doesn't work is because it's randomized. You do random students from random extracurriculars. If you do a comprehensive, you're going to catch more kids in a dragnet. Second of all, so he said it's basically because it's a half measure, it doesn't work. Second of all, he said there's no numbers. Which that's not unique. I already addressed that. Then third of all, he said we're inconveniencing students who don't take drugs. There was no impact to that. No reason to really prefer why inconveniencing students is a bad thing. And then third of all, he brought about the cost. And again, like he hasn't impacted the cost out. Education already costs billions of dollars. What's another, couple $100 million going to do to the school system, especially if we prevent kids from going into the prison system where we're not going to be paying for them in prison. Prisoners cost almost $45,000 to $50,000 a year just to keep there. So like, again, he goes on and he doesn't address the kind of moral imperative. So in the same way as kind of like an ending analogy, judges, what I would tell you as my last speech is like, when I was in high school, like when I was like super depressed, right? I struggled with cutting like pretty frequently. One of my buddies like totally grabbed me one day, pulled my shirt sleeve up and showed me like, this is what you're doing to yourself. And I think like the school should act like that friend, like my friend. The school should act like, roll your shirt sleeve up. Let me see, what have you been doing? Why? Because we're here for you. We're here for your best interests. We're not here to be some totalitarian regime to infringe on your privacy. Like, we're here to help you. Drugs harm you disproportionately. A kid's right to do drugs shouldn't be something that we're worried is infringed upon. It should be something that we take care of because it's going to better their future and the future of the populace as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, so his summary there ends with the fact that the school should act like your friend. Now, I'm going to ask you, what you to take drug tests to prove that you're not on drugs, especially given the fact that statistically 1 out of 10 is maybe using drugs, and there's not even evidence that they're abusing those drugs. That's the whole import of the fact that you're inconveniencing an entire group of people. You're securitizing the school system. You're replicating the racism of the drug war, all for this intangible benefit where you're like, well, we should respect the rights of the individual and we should give them a chance to succeed in life. It doesn't help them succeed in life to have a label attached to them that they are some sort of drug user or drug addict, despite the fact that maybe they just tried something once and then it shows up on a compulsory drug test, which I'm assuming would probably be random because it's not effective to test people on a schedule. Then they just don't take the drugs before it's scheduled. Trust me, I've had to take drug tests before. So here's the other thing. You seem to think that we can just disregard the quantitative value of this. 50.7 million people are in the public school system right now. You're also disregarding, once again, the false positive rate. You seem to think that the fact that 50,000 people would be subjected to false positives, ridicule, potential lifelong consequences because they're labeled as criminals is somehow a better world where we send less people to prison. No, you predicate those people to be offenders later in life because you've already labeled them as that as students. This is the same sort of studies that they do on why there's disproportionate effects on minority populations as the effects of the drug war impact them, as the effects of the prison system impact them, and as the effects of the school system impact them. You're creating a direct link between the prison industrial complex and the school system. We already have these metal detectors in the schools. You already have a lockdown system, and now you want to send the students in a line to go down to the bathroom, and they all have to pee in a cup to prove that they're a good little boy and girl. That is not the way that we need to enshrine the constitutional values of the right to privacy. Like, you can't disregard this fact, and you can't get out of it by claiming you can fiat your way past the Supreme Court. If you do that, then you're basically disregarding the entirety of what this country was founded upon. And at that point, what is the entire purpose of even caring about the educational system? You've completely undermined the notion of democracy, the notion that we as citizens have rights and that we can do what we want on our own time and not be tested for it days later in a completely irrelevant setting. That's the whole problem with this. 50,000 students, that's a number. There are no other numbers that have been offered in this debate. So you can take that quantitative reasoning as the number one voting subject in this round. Even if you go on the moral level, it's pretty immoral to screw 50,000 kids out of